Thank you, everybody. Welcome to West Palm Beach, Florida for the historic Big Sugar Summit. The Big Sugar Summit is going to feature some really important speakers, people who are experts in the field. But the summit is about you. It's about you coming together to hear, to digest, and to figure out what kind of action we need to take in order to change the current situation, which is not very good, folks. So let me start by first thanking our honored guests who come from places as far as Brazil and San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and our top experts in Florida who share their insights on various aspects of Big Sugar. I want to thank them for coming with us today. So what do we mean by the Big Sugar Summit? Well, first of all, it's big. I mean, great turnout, great participation. And big goes beyond all of you. It goes to the people that we're going to reach out to afterwards. We have a couple people videotaping the program today, and we are going to get the word out on the Big Sugar Summit and what was said here today to tens of thousands of people via the internet and other means. If you plan on asking a question today, we hope you have signed a waiver form because we do want to post the video afterwards on YouTube and other means of internet communication. So if you speak, realize that you may be on film and will be promoted. We hope you're willing to do that. So we're here today, then, not just to be a big summit, but to look at Big Sugar. Big Sugar is a term that we came up with because we realize it's not just one sugar corporation or another, but their combined power, particularly the two largest sugar companies, U.S. Sugar and Florida Crystals, is so great that many people think that the sugar industry is the most powerful single corporate entity in the state of Florida, exercising tremendous control over state government and even the federal government. We're going to pull back the curtain on Big Sugar today. We're going to take a look at its impact on the Everglades. We're going to take a look at its impact on people's health. We are going to take a look at the politics of Big Sugar and how Big Sugar has elevated itself into such a driving force, a controlling force in the state of Florida. We're going to look at the special privileges that sugar gets in terms of federal policies that helps it to inflate its price and make a bigger profit. And we're going to look at sugar as something that we consume and that we eat. We're going to have an expert talking about, hey, how does this affect our nutrition and our health as well? And I'm not going to steal his thunder, but that's going to be an interesting talk as well. We're going to take a look at all of the aspects of sugar and its impact on our society, or at least many of them. I think enough for us to be able to come to some conclusions at the end of the day. We will have a period following the speakers for people to make comments and suggestions and to talk about what your suggestions are moving forward. We hope you stay with us through a pretty long program, but I think a program that will be highly valuable. So at the end of the day, we hope we all will see the big picture. Our hope is that we'll start to see the way that we can start to limit the sugar industry's power and ability to control state politics, and that ultimately we are going to take the steps needed to cut Big Sugar down to size. I want to thank Sierra Club staff, Julia Hathaway, Jonathan Holman, and Chris Costello. Who have done the lion's share of the work in organizing the event today, but we also have a lot of volunteers who have contributed too. So let's give a big hand to the volunteers. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mary Barley, who's the chair of the Everglades Trust. Mary Barley currently serves on the board of the Everglades Foundation, having served as vice chairperson from 2003 to 2012, and chair from 1995 to 2002. Mary is a driving force in the Everglades Foundation and was one of the founders of it, and she'll tell you a little bit about that. Mary also serves on the boards of the National Parks Conservation Association, World Wildlife Fund Marine Leadership Committee, and the World Wildlife Fund National Council, the Atlantic Salmon Federation, Clean Water Action, and Wild Oceans. She has received many awards and accolades for her work, including being designated an honorary Miccosukee. And we're having the chairman of the Miccosukee tribe today as our guest speaker at lunch. An honorary conch by the mayor of Monroe County in 1999. And she was profiled in numerous magazines, including Time's Hero of the Planet. Let me welcome Mary Barley, true champion of the Everglades.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I think it's going to be a really important part of how we look at and go forward during this election year coming up. So each and every one of us should remember that. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and who I am, and then I'm going to tell you who Big Sugar is. I'm Mary Barley. I currently live in the Florida Keys. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I came to Florida, and I can remember the first time I saw it. I was 21 years old, and I was enthralled. I thought, I am never, ever going back to Wisconsin. And so I moved here, and I married a developer. Whoa, I know. But that developer became the hero for Everglades restoration. We had a house in the Florida Keys, and one day we went out, and our basin looked like pea soup. And one of the fishing guides called us, and he said, I want to take you out. So we went out over by Flamingo, Sandy Key, and that had turned into pea soup. George said, that is it. What we were doing, we were putting pumps in our basin, thinking we were going to fix the problem by putting 2 pumps in. So that's how we were thinking, and not on an ecosystem. And so George said, I'm going to find out what's happening here. He brought scientists together, and the scientists told us, you have to go as far up as Lake Okeechobee and to Orlando. You have to think about it as an ecosystem. You cannot fix it by putting 2 pumps in your basin. So he decided that what we had to do was do a ballot initiative. So in 1992, we did the first of our ballot initiatives. And when it got to the Supreme Court, they turned us down. So we had to go back and start all over again, because he said, we are not going to give up. So in 1994, we started a new ballot initiative, penny a pound. So we started looking and getting our signatures, and unfortunately in 1995, George died in an airplane crash. So that put us all back again, which is funny about the Everglades because it's always some crisis or catastrophe. It's a constant. You think you've won, everything is going great, and you have a depression, or you have something that happens to your leader. And so we all came together and we said, who will pick up the flag? And many of his friends, including myself, we said, we will do the job. So we went ahead, we did penny a pound, and we got that passed. We didn't get, well, I take that back, we didn't get penny a pound passed. We got make the polluter pay pass, and we got the trust fund. And all of you sugar people are here. I know you're in this room. It's okay. It's okay, because in the end, penny a pound would have been a heck of a lot cheaper than what you've had to put up with since. So we're happy. It turned out all right. But as we moved forward, we found out, what is Big Sugar and who are they? First of all, one of the bigger ones is the Fonville family who live here in Palm Beach County. They're from Cuba. They came here legally, and they built an incredible conglomerate. But what we did make them do, we made one of them become a U.S. citizen. So they have one who's a U.S. citizen, a Republican, and they have one who's not, a Democrat. So we have to think about all these things and how they come together. The other one, Big Sugar, U.S. Sugar, and we talk about them a lot, but you probably don't know who even owns U.S. Sugar. U.S. Sugar is owned 30% by the Mott Foundation, one of the premier environmental foundations in the United States of America, owns and controls U.S. Sugar, destroying Florida's environment. So what kind of foundation is that? 30% of it is owned by the Mott Children's Health Center. But have they come here and helped the children in our state? No. In fact, when we asked them, they said they don't put their money in Florida, where they make their money. The other 40% is owned by their pension fund and the employees. So we need to think about how we're going to approach them. Who can help us out of that group? The hypocrisy of the Mott Foundation, each and every one of us should be telling all of our friends and anybody we know what they do to this state. One of their top 4 things that they do is the environment and clean water. Imagine that. U.S. Sugar was convicted. It's a convicted felons. In 1992, they pled guilty to knowingly putting hazardous waste in the water, in our water, and then back pumping it back into Lake Okeechobee. They all stood up there and pled guilty, every single one of their top echelon. So remember this, not only are they polluting, they're criminals, convicted criminals. Why should we allow them to buy our politicians? We must go out and talk about voting. How are we voting? If you don't vote, it doesn't count. When people tell you, I'm not going to vote because it doesn't make a difference, it does make a difference. If you're not voting, it doesn't count. And so many of these elections lately have been lost by very few votes. It's up to us to get out there and make sure everyone we can find votes and helps and makes a difference. You cannot make a difference if you're standing on the sideline. So Big Sugar, we need to think about how we're going to handle and take care of them. And we're going to take care of them through our politicians, by letting them know that we will not allow them to put their profits over our climate, over our children's health, to put Big Sugar's profits over our water, over our economy. Now, they like to think that they're adding a lot, but do you know how much they add to Florida's economy? About 0.01%, if that. They are nothing to this state. Nothing that we need or want. So I hope today, when you go back and you listen to all these speakers and these panelists, and they tell you what sugar can do to you and your children and your health and your environment in this most incredible state that we live in, that you will say to yourself, I am not going to allow this to happen. I am going to go out and I am going to make a difference. I am going to put myself out there and make things happen. So I want to thank each and every one of you for listening to my tirade. And if you want to ask me any questions, please do later on or come up and find me. I'll be more than happy to have a chat. Thank you so much.
Let me say one last thing about Mary. You all heard of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, you know, who is the person you most think of when you think about Everglades restoration. When we think about making Big Sugar accountable, Mary Barley is our Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Okay, she has been the champion for us for the last 30 years, and it's really an honor that Mary is with us today. So let's give her another applause. Next, I'm going to introduce Gail Hollander, who's an associate professor of geography and for the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University. Dr. Hollander has a PhD in geography and is currently an associate professor at FIU, as I mentioned. She teaches courses on globalization, food studies, and economic geography. She has conducted extensive research on the political ecology of the sugar-producing region of South Florida, including ethnographic research in agricultural communities and archival work on the domestic and global political economy of production and trade. Hollander is author of the book, Raising Cane in the Glades, The Global Sugar Trade and the Transformation of Florida, as well as numerous journals, including Securing Sugar, National Security Discourse and the Establishment of Florida's Sugar Producing Region, which was published in Economy Geography, and Agricultural Trade Liberalization, Multifunctionality, and Sugar in the South Florida Landscape in the publication GeoForum. She is currently expanding her research on South Florida agriculture beyond sugarcane plantations to understand the role of horticulture in the region's development. She also works with other researchers to study adaptation to climate change in South Florida. Let's welcome Dr. Gail Hollander.
I'm not the Gail Hollander, I'm setting things up.
This better? Good morning and welcome. I want to thank Chris Costello for inviting me. I was intrigued and excited about this summit, and I am asked to discuss the history of sugar in Florida, which happens to be the subject of my book. So I've attempted to stuff the entire book into the next 25, 30 minutes, and here we go. Okay, can you hear me all right? Good, okay. One of the key arguments in my book is that the drainage of the Everglades and its transformation into agricultural production was far from predetermined. In other words, that it's important for us to see how it happened. This monumental transformation was the outcome of pitched political battles, reaching the highest offices in the United States and in countries around the world. So how the Everglades was transformed from a swamp to an agro-industrial site was contingent on complex interactions of geography, international political economy, and domestic agricultural politics. So I'm really juggling two stories. One is the history of a place, and the other is the history of a commodity. So let me talk a little bit first about the place. South Florida was what we call a latent frontier. In other words, it was still kind of a frontier even in the late 19th century. And it played a unique role in the geographical imagination of the country as the place that was going to free us from imports of foreign tropical commodities. One factor that provided the impetus for this was the fact that when Florida became a state, it was given 22 million acres of land through the Swamp and Overflowed Land Act. So the Florida government had this land to distribute, and the purpose of the distribution was that it would be developed. Now, to kind of cut short, about 30 years, there was a lot of mismanagement, surprise, surprise, and the people who were supposed to distribute it were in arrears and in receivership, and so the agency was rescued by Hamilton Diston. He and his associate got 4 million acres of land for $1 million. Pretty good deal. And there's a lot in that story, but what's important to us here is that he established sugarcane on drained land, and moreover, he caught the attention of a guy by the name of Harvey Wiley. And Harvey Wiley was the chief chemist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a man with a lot of power, who was very interested in championing domestic sugar production. And although Diston was developing an area around Kissimmee, Wiley got very, very interested in the south shore of Lake Okeechobee. He says this is from 1891. There is practically no other body of land in the world which presents such remarkable possibilities of development as the mucklands bordering the southern shores of Lake Okeechobee. In another writing, he said, even the island of Cuba could not compete with Florida in the production of sugar. And note the language of competition with Cuba. That's going to be a theme through my talk. So let me return to sugar for a moment. Sugar was the quintessential global commodity, the #1 traded item from 1600 to 1800, #1, like oil today. Sugarcane came to the Americas in 1493, after which followed centuries of plantation development. It was ground and milled in the Caribbean and refined and consumed in Europe. Production increased exponentially, as did consumption, so diets shifted too. Then, in the 19th century, Europeans discovered they could produce their own sugar using sugar beets. So in 1840, 95% of sugar came from cane, and 50 years later, 2/3 was coming from beet sugar. So you can imagine, there was a lot of sugar in the world, too much, a surplus, a lot of competition, a problem for sugar growers. This global crisis led to increased protectionism, and the U.S. was no exception. The newly formed U.S. Department of Agriculture aggressively promoted sugar production. So I'm saying that in order to understand the expansion of sugar, in Florida, we have to understand some of this background. Beginning in the late 19th century, all sorts of people, politicians, economists, and so forth, called this the sugar question. And that's what I'm referring to in the title. They called it the sugar question. And what they meant by that was debates about who should produce sugar, how it should be produced. Did we owe anything to our former colonies? Did it matter how it was produced? Did the labor relations matter? So on and so forth. Also around this time, European scientists were experimenting and thought they found and proved that sugar improved endurance, especially for soldiers. So they began to think of this as a national security issue. I know. So They hadn't yet discovered vitamins. That was the problem. They figured out calories, but they didn't understand vitamins. Anyway, so at this time, the United States was only producing 13% of its supply, and so there was a lot of interest in promoting sugar production, especially in the South, where you see old lady cotton sitting by the wayside and the young thing, and it's a whole bunch of issues in this that are. But this is a political cartoon from the era, insulting in many levels. Okay, a key figure in this was a guy in the boosterism was a guy by the name of Herbert Myrick, who was famous in his day. He was a publisher and editor in numerous journals, and this was a booklet that he produced. And the title, which is very long, says it all. Sugar, a new and profitable industry in the United States for capital, agriculture, and labor to supply the home market yearly with $100 million of its product, because that's how much they felt the United States was spending. He thought U.S. sugar imports were a crime, and so he was very, very interested in expanding production. However, 1897, that year should ring a little bell. 1898, Spanish-American War, redraws the geography of sugar sourcing. We acquire sugar islands, right? And we have a new relationship with Cuba. Now, this is sweet Cuba. She's holding sugar cane. That's an angry planter holding her back because there are tariffs still on Cuban sugar. But we had formal ties to Cuba, and our investments there grew. So the sugar question in the United States then became international. And I'm not going to read this just to prove to you this is how they were talking about these things at this time. This is a U.S. economist in 1902, and he says, a colonial policy as well as a tariff policy is now involved in the sugar question. So they're nervous, because this is new for the U.S. So Florida's significance as a subtropical frontier was diminished. And Harvey Wiley, who had loved the south shore of Lake Okeechobee, wrote in 1901, "We need not expect any expansion of cane sugar in the United States." Myrick was bitter. He wrote, "Free trade with Cuba will permanently blight Florida and almost annihilate her agricultural industries." So, World War I came along, and that was their saving grace. Cuba had to supply the Allies. Wartime disrupted shipping. The issue here was proximity to sources. There was a lot of sugar in the world, but it was a question of getting it moved. And so they began, let me see. Oh, that image doesn't show up. Well, it kind of shows. That's a booklet called The Sugar Situation, written by one of the Florida boosters. And he's asking the question, where are you going to get your sugar after the war? Because now Europe is used to eating Cuban sugar. You won't have any. And here's the map that, quote, proves where you will get sugar under U.S. national supply. And if you look at it very closely, the little lines at the base of Florida, the horizontal lines, say cane matures in 1 year, and you can crystallize sugar from here. So they've identified again that this is where we should get our domestic supply of sugar. So we can see that Florida was being positioned strategically to produce sugar. This boosterism coincided with a very optimistic assessment of drainage in Florida. And so in 1923, the Florida Sugar and Food Products Company established a mill at Canal Point. Okay. At the end of World War I, there was a lot of sugar, too much, prices were going down. They spiked and then fell. Cuba tried to reduce production to stabilize. Meanwhile, the United States continued to encourage production and increase tariffs, which stimulates domestic production, right? And we kept building up to something called, and I apologize for this, it's two people's names, Smoot-Hawley, the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. And it's important because it devastated the Cuban industry, but also because there are reams and reams of testimony in the hearings. And previously, everyone attributed them to the U.S. beet interests, but I didn't think that was totally right. So I dug around and found an interesting Senate document that showed that one of the key lobbyists was a Florida sugar producer. Surprise. And that was Rohr Dahlberg, whose actions ultimately were investigated by the Senate Committee on the Judiciary. So he moved from Louisiana to Clewiston in 1926 to take over the previous company and named his Southern Sugar. So there's Clewiston, in case you don't know where it is. In 1929, Southern Sugar claimed 130,000 acres and had planted 25,000 in sugarcane. But Dahlberg had another agenda. He wanted to break the Democratic hold on the U.S. South. And he wanted to do that because they were free trade, and he wanted protectionism. So Louisiana, that was too tough. Politics weren't so open. It was more fluid in Florida. He created a network of lobbyists. He had employees kept in Washington to lobby, employees working with Republican Party members in Florida. He had one who worked very closely with the newspaper editor to make sure that nothing was said against Republicans there. And after the election, a party operative wrote to him and said, I want you to be recognized for having gotten, Florida's votes for Hoover. And I mean, I think that these memorandum are probably flattering and exaggerating a bit. Nonetheless, Dahlberg had a quid pro quo. And this is his memo back. This is what he wanted. The Republican administration should do these things. They should recognize that we got these votes. And here's what he wanted. He wanted assistance, and this is from his memo, assisting in the control of Lake Okeechobee, assisting in the development of waterways, and putting on an adequate import duty. So this is right around the time of the Smoot-Hawley Act. This is the party writing back to him. I've succeeded in, I succeeded in getting the administration forces lined up. It will go through, we will get everything we were asking for. If the engineer's report comes through in the right shape, we will put it through without having hearing either here or in Florida. So, Dahlberg went to Washington himself to lobby for the tariff, and I just want to emphasize one thing. He said, we must have adequate protection against the competitor who is now dumping sugar on us at ruinous prices, that is Cuba. The outcome was that Smoot-Hawley Act tariff was much higher than recommended and punitive to Cuba. Even with tariffs, by 1932, in the midst of the Depression, Southern Sugar was bankrupt. So, President Roosevelt thought he should try to balance all of these interests. And to do that, his New Deal policy was to assign quotas to producers. This is the U.S. sugar program. So choose a consumption level, every producer gets a quota and they can't go above it. Sounds good, and he could give a quota to Cuba. They wanted to stabilize Cuba, to Puerto Rico, to Virgin Islands, so on. The problem, of course, was that makes this very, very political. So it's still the Congress and the Secretary of Agriculture who are making the decisions. So the Sugar Act actually generated ceaseless and intense lobbying. Florida's lobbying was led by Clarence Biding, who was then vice president of, who was chairman of USSC for 15 years. And he and Charles Stewart Mott, who came to Clewiston sometimes, he divided his time between there and Detroit because he was an active vice president at General Motors. The two of them took over Southern Sugar, renamed it United States Sugar Corporation, thinking this is going to sound good, strategic. And Biding really took the initiative in defining the sugar question. This was the context. And so one of his targets was always Cuba. in his booklet entitled Cuba, he said that Cuba was ungrateful, untruthful, and greedy, among other things. He used a lot of photos, and I want to run through some. Okay, this was his main message. American market belongs to the American producer. And you can see what an important source Cuba was at the time. So what he did is he would give other regions and show why they weren't deserving or why they weren't modern. So here's plowing sugarcane in Louisiana. Nope. They're using animal power. And here we are in the Everglades. We use machines. Harvesting sugarcane in Cuba using women, God forbid. In Florida, we only use men. Living in Cuba actually looks kind of, anyway, that's a little thatched roof building, whereas in the Everglades, we have nice houses for our workers. Okay. In actuality, and I know this is a little hard to see, but I think it's a very interesting piece of artwork produced in 1943. At the top it says, in the little box it says, U.S. indicts sugar planters for holding Negro laborers in peonage in Florida. And that is true. They did indict them. And at the bottom it says, and while you're in there, find out something about a fellow named Abe Lincoln. So this is coming from another voice, obviously, from Charles Alston, is the name of the artist. These are also produced by U.S. Sugar. I found them in the attic of one of their buildings. They produced these cartoons and then sent them out to newspapers around the country. So, you know, okay. It's all the same story. They're fed up with the quota. They want a bigger quota. How am I doing on time? Because I've got a bit left to do. Okay, I can do it. You ready for the rest? The propaganda war, oh, I did have one other image. And this is the front leaf of a book, Sugar in Florida, published in Havana in 1941. And they're kind of going, what the heck? Why are these people obsessed with us? And it's a history of Florida sugar. And the last chapter, if you could read it, is the campaign of Florida against Cuba. And it's actually very interesting to see their response. I mean, anyway. But the propaganda war between Florida and Cuba over quotas was overshadowed by World War II, of course. And so the geography of war was, of sourcing was reconfigured as it had been during World War I. And Congress lifted quotas, so the idea was that the sugar industry could grow during this period to produce for wartime. Sugar was now being used in synthetic rubber and other products, so it was really a strategic good beyond feeding soldiers. And so Cuba was asked to turn over all of its production to its ally, the United States, at reasonable prices. The U.S. bought the entire Cuban crop throughout the war. So Cuba switched from underproducing to full-on production as much as possible. Florida was unable to increase for a variety of reasons. So after the war, the State Department said, you know, we need to keep Cuba's quota as it is, at least as a reward. But Congress didn't agree, and the Sugar Act of 1948 was generous to Florida and not so generous to Cuba. And so this is the part of my talk that I call the Cold War heats up the sugar bowl. So the National Security Council said, as far as the strategic use of sugar, Cuba has been our only reliable supplier. The domestic producers haven't been able to ramp up during war. But domestic users disagreed and asked Congress to revisit the Sugar Act retroactively. So it wasn't due to expire, but they wanted a bigger quota. And they wanted it at Cuba's expense. The State Department and National Security Council warned against this, and in 1954, the Secretary of State wrote this. And he's saying the proposal would be a bitter repayment for Cuba's efforts to stabilize the sugar market. It ignores the fact that Cuba was a reliable source. And he says it could tip the scales to cause revolution in Cuba, would certainly increase instability and promote anti-American feeling. U.S. State Department memos warned that it would weaken the Batista government, render it more vulnerable, and more to the point, the U.S. ambassador in Havana believed any change in sugar legislation before the expiry date would mean the fall of the present government. But politicians representing the sugar states lobbied President Eisenhower to support rewriting of the Sugar Act. Eisenhower met with them, and in particular with Senator Holland of Florida, who explained to the president that the legislation was critical to his state. When Eisenhower was reluctant to do this, the USDA secretary warned him, quote, of the great political strength of the domestic sugar interests, and suggested, quote, the president should carefully weigh the political difficulties which would result from opposing them. In 1955, 14 sugar bills were introduced into the House. It was the sugar question revisited. Exacerbating this surplus was a downward trend in U.S. sugar consumption per capita. U.S. News and World Report noted, U.S. sugar consumption is sliding off. A tug of war is developing between U.S. and Cuban growers for a shrinking market. Enter the Sugar Research Foundation. Formed in 1943, it's spelled national, as a quasi-scientific organization to counter U.S. governmental nutrition advice that it was okay to eat less sugar during war when there was less sugar, funded by major sugar processors, producers, and growers, and it's today known as the Sugar Association. So the foundation asked the Cuban industry to back its campaign to increase U.S. sugar consumption. So Cubans from all ranks of the industry joined forces with the foundation in a propaganda effort, and they actually paid dues, and I've seen the receipts of the dues that were paid by sugar workers and Cuban farmers and growers and the Havana Rotary Club, and to put these ads in women's magazines. What makes people fat? What is the fastest way to raise your blood sugar level and keep from overeating? Sugar, right? Or, how many calories in a spoon of sugar? And the first number is it 200? 150? No, it's only 18. And so they were promoting sugar as a diet and health good. However, it was all in vain. Despite Cubans' best efforts and strongly worded opinions from the State Department, Congress passed the Sugar Act of 1956, and Eisenhower signed it. The act retroactively cut Cuba's market and increased domestic. The response from Cuba was immediate. The Cuban Secretary of Agriculture published a statement that the law had not done justice to Cuba. In July, Presidents Eisenhower and Batista met in Panama City. Batista reminded Eisenhower that sugar comprised 87% of Cuba's exports. And Eisenhower replied, quote, everyone is mad about the sugar situation. And then he noted, quote, the American form of government is such that it is impossible to make promises as to what we can and cannot do. And then he suggested that they step outside to be photographed. But photo opportunities were not sufficient to the Cuban economy. In April, the State Department was informed of a pending sale of Cuban sugar to the Soviet Union, and officials voiced surprise that Cuba would do that. And they said cognizance will be taken of that. So I'm not contending that the 1956 Sugar Act triggered the revolution. There were a lot of problems. But I am pointing out that there was widely held perception within the U.S. government that cutting the quota would be destabilizing. The State Department was clear about that. The USDA held a different opinion. In the months after the revolution, the U.S. administration attempted to assess where the new Cuban administration was going, and sugar quota was central to its negotiations. And the major arsenal in the U.S.'s position was sugar. The State Department wanted that quota kept as a tool of negotiation. The USDA was less patient, and in December 1960, Eisenhower suspended Cuba's sugar quota, which threw the whole US sugar system into chaos. So domestic growers saw their chance. USDA memos recounts, quote, "The demand for acreage by new growers is reaching the breaking point. Something must give. The most vociferous demands are from grower groups wishing to get new mills established in Florida." The problem was that until 1960, the system had been structured around Cuba as the swing producer, the buffer. And even though we had a structured market, we met all of our shifts in need by going to Cuba. Now, we didn't have that, and so the USDA lifted production controls off of domestic production in Cuba. Business Week chronicled a moving day parade from Louisiana of mills and a moving day parade of sugar growers. And it was indeed a parade. It was a parade of big names in sugar and in other industry. So you had the likes of Talisman Sugar, which was backed by Henry Ford II, and Fernando de la Riva, who was the second largest producer in Cuba. You had Michael Malone, who was the vice president of Ciarnaco Rionda, which was the second largest sugar broker in the world, who came to Florida to set up cattle ranches and sugar and help exiles make the transition. You had William Pauley, who was a close friend of President Nixon, who was involved in many covert operations, and he was also a backer of sugar plantations. So we always hear about one or two people, but this was a network of people coming here. Land prices in the Florida Sugar Bowl doubled in 1 year. The region was transformed with $100 million of capital, representing the investment of exiled Cubans and Americans coming from Cuba. As Business Week suggested, capital such as now pouring into Florida sugar is not attracted by the comparatively small immediate gain. Investors are betting that Florida will become a more important supplier for good. Florida wanted favorable treatment in the next Sugar Act, so investors tried to expand production quickly. They were moving as fast as they could. They knew if they had a cane in the ground, there would be history. If there was a history of sugar in the ground, they would get that in their quotas. So you can see how quickly it grew in those 5 years. And let me point out that the 30 years that I've gone through very quickly gave them the things that they needed. They had labor control in the form of the H2 worker program. They had water control in the form of water management that was done by the state and the federal government. And now, for Florida producers, most determinately, they had a geopolitical situation in which their chief rival for a share of the US market was disqualified. So the geography of the debate over sugar shifted, and a leading Cuban producer, whose family now owns the largest company in Florida, wrote in 1961, "The potentials that Florida has in sugar are such that we in Cuba never could have realized them until we came here and saw them. And I hope to look back in the midst of our tragedy and say how fortunate we were to decide to go into it." So I hope that sort of understanding how we got here a little bit is helpful in thinking about how to move forward. And you can see that upward spike, which diminished a bit, has continued since then. So I've given you acreage over time up till today. Thank you very much.
Yes, Dave? John, what's our time check?
Microphone.
Okay, well, I'm just checking with John. We have 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to ask both Mary Barley and Gail Hollander to be on stage so you can ask questions of either one. Okay? If you would like to ask a question, please line up at the microphone, which is in the center aisle. Okay, please identify yourself when you speak.
Drew Martin, I'm the Conservation Chair for the Waxahachie Group of the Sierra Club and the former chair for the Everglades Committee for the Sierra Club. I want to ask a little bit about, you talked about the water projects, but you didn't mention the was it the 28 or 29 hurricane and the loss of so many workers during that, and how did that impact the changes to the water system and the drainage system in the Lake Okeechobee area?
Right. So that's really important, and that's why, again, when I said I feel that there's exaggeration in what Dahlberg claims, certainly the Hoover Dike, which was put up after that, was a response to that hurricane. I think what we'd have to look at is, were there different options in terms of water management at that time to achieve defense of life versus water control for agriculture? And that's what Dahlberg was claiming. But yes, of course, those hurricanes were really important. And in terms of loss of life, it was mostly agricultural workers who lost their life.
I just want to follow up too with a question about the huge fires that occurred once that drainage took place around the Miami area, and how that drainage caused so much devastation to the Everglades ecosystem.
And I'd like to say one thing, which is funny, reading Clarence Gidding, the guy I mentioned who wrote all those little booklets about U.S. sugar, he actually was against all of that excess drainage. And he thought that it should be, he used the words rewatering and restoring for lands that were, at the time he was writing, drained but not used. And he also felt that those lands weren't that suitable for agriculture. So remember, U.S. agriculture, U.S. sugar was up around close to the lake, and those lands farther south, he thought, should be returned. So it's interesting. He sounds kind of like an ecologist when he writes about it, even though he was actually the president of the sugar company.
Hi, Laura Reynolds with the Tropical Audubon Society. I wanted to thank you for your talk. It was really educational. I can't wait to read your book. But has anyone here, including yourself, given any thought to how our new relationship with Cuba may change the future of sugar?
I think that's a really important question, and if I had had more time, I also would have mentioned that during the free trade area politics, if anyone remembers that, about 10 years ago, we saw the sugar industry fighting against the free trade area on the basis of Brazilian sugar. And so, believe me, I'm sure they've been thinking about this. I think some of the individuals are thinking about, who already are producing, like in Florida and the Dominican Republic, are thinking about whether they could actually return and begin to produce transnationally that way. So yes, there's people in IFAS, the Institute for Food and Agricultural Science at Gainesville, who have thought about this.
Right. Not that I would wish all of that phosphorus on Cuba, but just a thought.
Yes.
I'm Justin Cook in Miami, and would you spell out a little more in detail the 1959-1960 and how the Van Hoels came up with the money? The 1959 is the Exodus fleeing Castro, and they all came into Miami, and they had this money. So this is a real turning point. The people who worked on their staff had all the knowledge in their head to replicate the work of even the rich people. And you talk about the expanse of the, wanting more land in Florida. But, this is critical, the point. And you described them as Cubans, but and they are Cubans, but they
it's complicated.
But the sons went to school in
New York.
In New York.
Right. Yeah, I know.
Like
and this is something, I mean, a lot of them were one generation from Spain. They were in Cuba. They thought of themselves as transnationals, really. As, educated in the United States, a lot of times spent much of the year in the U.S. And so, you know, we're talking about capital, and capital really does and doesn't have a nationality. You know.
Wasn't their mother American?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Their mother was an American.
Yeah.
Hi, Steve Malagotti from 350 South Florida. And I realize that due to your time constraints, you had to really focus on Cuba as the main focus. But I was wondering, how big a role did sugar production in the Dominican Republic and Haiti play? And of course, we see now the opening with Cuba, and all of a sudden the threat of mass deportation of Haitian workers back to
Right.
Haiti. So
Right.
could you talk a little bit about the GR and the fund, maybe the fund rules relationship there?
Yeah, I can do that a little bit. So what happened when the Cuban quota was cut is that a lot more countries got little quotas also, including, I mean, the domestic producers got more, but a lot of countries became suppliers. And one of them was the Dominican Republic under Trujillo, who was a dictator. And that quota became, the Dominican Republic in a smaller way sort of took on the role that Cuba had played in terms of expecting quotas and asking for quotas, and there was a lot of diplomacy around that. So in terms of, yeah, you sort of answered a bunch of complicated questions that link together, and I understand what you're getting at, which is that some of the same workers who worked for the Fanjols in the Dominican Republic, when they came to South Florida, suddenly and had legal status to be here, were suddenly no longer considered fit to work because they weren't deportable. I mean, that was one of the issues that was going on. So Haitian workers in Belle Lake weren't given jobs in the industry at a time when the same people might have worked for them in the Dominican Republic. So, yeah, I mean, there's just so many issues. And, yeah, but you're right. The Dominican Republic became an important player.
Okay, so I'm going to say these two speakers and Mary Barley, and then we've got to cut the questions off and go to our next panel. All right. And let me just say before you speak, those people who have already asked a question, you should have on your desk in front of you, there should be a release form. Please sign the release form, and someone will pick it up from you. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Edward Tedman, Waxahachie Group. This question came to me during your great presentation. Thank you. And it's regarding fertilizers and maybe the effect on the phosphate mining industry here in the state, if there's any interesting districts in this. Thank you.
Yeah, that's, I don't know, that's a really good question, and because I partly grew up near the Peace River in Charlotte County, I'm very interested in it because it's affected by the phosphate industry. But I don't know of the ties, and there's a dissertation for somebody who wants to work on that. It's a great question, and I don't think the Florida phosphate industry has been studied enough either. Yeah.
I'm Vivian D'Angio, excuse me, with the Waxahachie Group. My husband and I moved here in '78, and in those days, if the sugar workers raised any fuss about their living condition or not being paid properly, Sheriff Willie was there. He loaded them on buses, and he got reelected and reelected. My question is, what role did local politics have in Big Sugar being the way it is today?
That's a great question, and I think that's really, really important. And I know I talked about the national level and the international level today, but actually what my book was about, in a sense, was how did that make a place, and how did that structure the politics in the place? And certainly, there was, number one, the production, if you ever went to the sugar producing area at this time, there were villages, 8 villages for one company of barracks with thousands of men, but those were not on any map. I mean, they're very hidden. You couldn't even get to them. If you tried to get there, there was barbed wire and dogs and so forth. So it was very, very difficult for anyone from outside to reach people or talk to them. And you're absolutely right. That was, quote, how things were done, and at the local scale, maybe some people questioned it, but not in the paper. I read a lot of Clewiston News, the historic archives and so forth, and yeah, you're right.
I have a question. I'm surprised that you didn't talk about in the 1980s when there was a price support put in for sugar. At that time, there was only about 80,000 acres in sugar in the EAA or something like that, which it went up to like 400 and...
No, there were more. There were, in the final...
In sugar. There was a lot of vegetables and other things. Maybe I've got the 80 a little mixed up. But the price support really had a lot to do with what has happened and what is happening now, and I'm wondering why you didn't talk about that in your talk.
So the sugar program expired in 19... Well, number one, because I didn't think I had enough time. But I put the curve that shows the entire... Can you... That's okay.
Well, it's a guaranteed profit, and I think that's important for everybody here to understand.
But the sugar program always operated that way. So it was a quota with the U.S. price, and that's why so many producers around the world wanted access to the U.S. market. So it operated that way, except for a brief period when it expired in the 1970s. And if you look at the line, production in Florida increased with or without that, and they had already produced over 225,000 acres in 1965. So it's actually sort of a steady curve, because in between the expiration and the 1981 Farm Bill and the 1985 bill, they were able to increase production, and then they got the quotas back that allowed them to continue. But that set price is true for anyone who produces for the U.S. market, foreign or domestic. But it's also true for much sugar in the world. So only a small portion of sugar actually works through the free market. It's called the residual market. It's important, that price, but no one thing is going to be determinative. It has to be, in other words, just getting rid of price supports isn't going to be the only thing. There have to be a lot of other things.
I want to thank Gail Hollander, thank Mary Barley. Let's give them a big hand. I'd like Stephen Davis and Richard Grosso to come to the front. Let me ask while they're putting up, how is the sound level? How are the sound levels? Are people having any problems hearing? Okay, seems like it's pretty good. All right, thanks. All right, if you go take a seat. John, you're going to... Okay, our next panel is something that a lot of people are waiting for. Sugar's impact on the Everglades, the need to send the water south. We have two distinguished speakers. First, I'm going to introduce Stephen Davis, a wetlands ecologist for the Everglades Foundation. Dr. Stephen Davis is the Everglades Foundation's wetlands ecologist, a native of Dayton, Ohio. He received a master's degree in biological and environmental sciences from Moorhead State University in 1995. and a PhD from Florida International University in 1999 with research focused on Everglades mangrove biogeochemistry in response to variations in the freshwater flow. Davis's wetlands research program dates back 2 decades, most recently at Texas A&M University, where as a professor of wetland ecology, he led research on the importance of freshwater inflows in driving, I never get this right, estuarine,
That's great.
estuarine, water quality, plankton dynamics, and marsh ecology, and was responsible for more than $1.5 million in research support. Davis began working for the Everglades Foundation in 2009. At the foundation, he is researching sea level rise impacts in coastal wetlands and extends his science program through his involvement with Everglades restoration, planning, and science synthesis activities. In recognition for his outreach work, Davis was awarded Best in Miami for Advancing the Sciences by Miami Today. Davis has worked on the National Science Foundation's Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program for 15 years. He is co-chair of the Biogeochemistry Working Group, and he serves on the advisory board of Florida International University's School of Environment, Arts, and Society. He has published his science in more than 40 peer-reviewed technical journal articles. Let's welcome Dr. Stephen Davis.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Frank and Chris and John for their just outstanding support and having me, inviting me to be a part of this meeting. Appreciate you all coming today. I'm going to extend Gail's presentation from sort of the historical perspective and take us to where we are today in the Everglades ecosystem and talk about some of the impediments to restoration, in particular the real essence of Gail's talk and how that affects us in restoring the Everglades ecosystem today. But first I want to take a brief step back in time. Some of you I know have seen this image. It's basically what South Florida would look like if we had a satellite back in the late 1800s. And what you see is a very broad, expansive Everglades ecosystem. There's an extensive area of sawgrass plains just south of Lake Okeechobee that helped to develop those deep muck soils that we now know were very suitable for agriculture and were really the focus of those drainage efforts in the 1800s. I also want to point out that white narrow strip along the southeast coast. This is the high ground in South Florida. This is the area we first developed, the Atlantic Coastal Ridge. And really, these are the Everglades Keys of the Florida Peninsula. And then you also have the Florida Keys that extend down to Key West. Many of you know that. But really, this was a high, rocky ground in South Florida. And as you moved off of that ridge to the west, you were in Everglades wetland. Let's fast forward to what this system looks like today. And the first thing you notice is that it's very disconnected from the lake. Instead of those expansive sawgrass plains south of the lake, we now know that we have that large Everglades agricultural area, much of which is in sugar production. And I can't get into all the historical drivers of this. There was mention of the hurricanes in the 1920s. That led to the construction of the Herbert Hoover Dike around Lake Okeechobee. That also reinforced that divide between the headwaters, which was Lake Okeechobee, and the River Grass to the south. And as we developed in South Florida, you can see we moved off of that ridge. We moved westward into those areas that were flooded for much of the year. So there was a need for flood control in addition to water supply. So the infrastructure that we have in South Florida today it was built that way intentionally. The problems that we experience environmentally are a direct outcome of the infrastructure as it was intended to be built. So the Everglades is also reduced in size. We've lost about 50% of the area of the ecosystem, and obviously a lot of that is attributable to the construction and maintenance of that agricultural area south of the lake. It's also a highly compartmentalized system because now we have cut off the Everglades from its headwater supply, Lake Okeechobee. They realized very early on that we need to contain what little water we have in the Everglades for our water supply. So the water conservation areas were constructed to retain water for as long as possible. Now, which of the ecosystems that we see here is going to suffer most from this? We know the situation in the northern estuaries. When the lake fills up, we have to send that water to east and west. And Everglades National Park in Florida Bay, at the extreme southern end, effectively gets no water. In fact, we're in a situation today where the park has not received a drop of water from the water conservation areas for going on a few months now. And so this infrastructure collectively, we know, has led to an ecological collapse of the Everglades. We have more than 70 threatened or endangered species that depend on one or more parts of the ecosystem. We have extensive water quality problems that we're dealing with. We're seeing fisheries declines in our estuaries. We have a whole host of problems as a result of this infrastructure that's provided us with the ability to really live and survive in South Florida. The Central and South Florida Project gave us the capacity to develop South Florida what it is today. And Shannon Estenos refers to this as the early sort of economic stimulus project. And that's really what happened. It allowed us to develop South Florida, but it came at a cost. We also know that we can fix that. So I'm going to go through a brief segment of an animation here. If you'll bear with me, this will take a second, just to show you the flow paths of water through the ecosystem. If I can get this to advance just a little bit. Maybe. I am Windows illiterate. Oh, it's unfortunate. Well, so I effectively described the situation. When we have water flowing into Lake Okeechobee, many of you know when the lake fills up, we have to discharge massive quantities of water to the east and the west. That water, we all recognize, also used to flow south into what we know as the River of Grass, through the area that is the agricultural area today. Very little water now makes it into the Everglades protection area. What we effectively get is runoff from the agricultural area. We know that water is polluted. We know through science that we have to clean that water up to a standard that's protective of Everglades marshes. That standard is 10 parts per billion. It's an extremely low concentration of phosphorus, and it's effectively taking a teaspoon of powdered phosphorus and dumping it into an Olympic-sized swimming pool, stirring it up, and that's about the phosphorus concentration that the Everglades needs in order to be healthy and thrive. Now, the Everglades evolved to very low nutrient concentrations because it's a rainfall-driven ecosystem. These are the concentrations of phosphorus that we have typically in rainfall. Actually, the Everglades does a better job of cleaning it up from there. So it's a very nutrient-sensitive environment. We know we've modified the flow, and some of the impacts from this, mentioned already, those massive discharges from Lake Okeechobee to the east and the west. Several of you I know are from communities that experienced this in 2013 with these massive black water plumes flowing down the Caloosahatchee River into St. Lucie over on the east coast. Those problems, we don't need to rehash. Those are very fresh in our mind. This is an illustration just to give you a sense of the impacts of reduced flow on the River of Grass to the south of Lake Okeechobee. So if we have models that allow us to simulate what the hydrology was like in the Everglades. Let's take an average year, 1978, and compare the hydro period of the marshes. So the area, the wetter it was. In fact, it goes up to 12 months of flooding throughout the year. On the left, which is the pre-drainage state, compare that to the current state, where you see very little of the Everglades is actually flooded or saturated throughout the year. In fact, it's a very disconnected ecosystem when we add the fact that It's very compartmentalized with the water conservation areas, dams like Tamiami Trail, etc. It's also disconnected, and we have imbalanced water levels. So it's not a river of grass anymore. It doesn't have a continuous depth and flow of water across the surface. We actually have a situation, this is a map of the hydrology from 1 month ago, and you can see the very blue area of water backing up along the L67s. You can see water piling up along the lower end of Water Conservation Area 2. Down here south of Tamiami Trail in Shark River Slough, which is should be the deepest part of the Everglades here, has very little water. And I mentioned earlier, the park is really drying out, and we're seeing the consequences of that in Florida Bay that I'll talk about shortly. This was a photo I took a month ago at Pahioki Overlook in Everglades National Park. Some of you, I'm sure, have been out there. This is an area right along Shark River Slough. Again, this is one of the deeper areas of the River of Grass. And for over a month now, going on 2 months, this soil is dried, it's cracked, and we're actually running the risk of losing soil elevation as a result of this. As these organic soils are exposed to air, they oxidize, they break down, and we lose elevation very quickly. And that obviously will have an effect not only on subsequent years of hydrology, but also as sea level rises, and I'll touch on that in a minute. We have hypersalinity in Florida Bay. We have that today, and I'll show you an example of that. We have a situation where we know now that these hypersalinity events are leading to fisheries declines in places like Florida Bay. And we're also seeing the accelerated impacts of sea level rise. And it's not just habitat movement across the landscape. We're seeing some pretty dramatic changes as a result of some freshwater marshes being exposed to salt. And I'll really highlight these last 3 bullets for the rest of my talk. So if we go down to the bottom of the system, Florida Bay, this is where the river of grass would empty into the sea. Water would wrap around Cape Sable from Shark River Slough and flow into the western areas of Florida Bay. That inflow would be attenuated very rapidly because some of you know that Florida Bay is a very complicated ecosystem full of shallow seagrass banks and mangrove islands that really prevent the exchange of water with the interior of the bay. Unfortunately, Shark River Slough is only getting about 50% of the flow that it received historically. So this is a pretty significant reduction in flow to the system. But the more important source of fresh water into Florida Bay is what comes in at the interior of the bay, Taylor Slough. And here we're only getting about 1/3 of what we received historically. And it doesn't flow along those blue flow vectors. Currently, the flow into Florida Bay is flowing along those red lines because of the C-111 canal system that has allowed for water to pile up into eastern Florida Bay or be dumped into lower Biscayne Bay through the S-197 structure. The C-111 spreader project is actually a positive story. This is a project that the state of Florida went out ahead of the federal government, constructed the first phase of this, the Western project. We are already seeing the initial benefits of this project that starts to push water back along those blue flow vectors towards the center of Florida Bay. But actually, we are concerned now about the phased implementation of this project to meet its maximum potential, the potential that was actually sold to Congress because of some concerns over flooding in the South Dade agricultural areas. So if we just look at salinities currently, out on the Florida shelf, it's usually around 36 parts per thousand or so, 35, 36 parts per thousand along the Atlantic. If we look in the interior of Florida Bay, I pulled these data just from last week. In the interior, we're seeing salinities even up into places like Taylor River, which are well up into the Everglades, 37 parts per thousand. So we're seeing higher salinities up there, and then out into the central part of Florida Bay, which is really lacking freshwater inflow, we're seeing 58 to 48 parts per thousand salinity. So quite a bit higher than that of seawater. And overall, through a number of studies by the U.S. Geological Survey and Dr. Frank Marshall, we know that paleosalinities in Florida Bay and their historic flows were about 3 to 9 parts per thousand lower across the bay. So we've seen this much of an increase since we've diverted flow from the south. And one of the real interesting emerging science findings is the impacts of hypersalinity on the spotted sea trout. Just Everglades sport fish industry in general generates close to $900 million annually. So this is a significant contributor to the economy. Spotted sea trout is one of the most commonly caught fish, or actually used to be commonly caught fish in Florida Bay. It was the second most. And you hear stories of fishing guides that if we couldn't catch a bonefish, at least we could pull in 50 to 100 spotted sea trout. And this wasn't that long ago. This is an interesting species because it spends its entire life history in Florida Bay. So that allows us to really understand the impacts of reducing freshwater inflow on the health of this population. It's not being influenced by migration patterns up to the upper Gulf or even as far up as Virginia for things like tarpon. This is a fish that we know is affected directly by conditions within the bay. And there have been a number of studies to show that it reduces its performance when salinity gets above 40 parts per thousand. Chris Kelbel at NOAA and some of his colleagues recently presented this figure at the Greater Everglades Ecosystem Restoration meeting. And the takeaway here, these are different areas of Florida Bay. Western Bay at the upper left, Rankin Lake, Whipray Basin, and the Crocodile Dragover area. And what you see for Rankin, Whipray, and Crocodile Dragover is that spotted sea trout plummeted about 8 years ago, and they haven't come back. Western Bay was kind of considered to be the stronghold, and this past year with high salinities, we've seen what appears to be a similar drop out there. And if you talk to any fishing guide that's been out in Florida Bay the past couple of years, they'll tell you that they're not seeing any spotted sea trout. So this is a concern. It's something that we're going to continue to follow, and Chris's work is really helping us to understand the impacts of hypersalinity on this species. Well, we have a plan, right? We know that the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was a collection of projects around the Greater Everglades ecosystem to help us resolve these issues associated with the Central and South Florida project. We're 15 years into this plan. It was signed into law in 2000. And the main idea of the SERP plan was really to build storage to compensate for the loss of wetlands and the loss of connectivity between Lake Okeechobee and the river grass to the south. And so just conceptually, the idea was to replumb the ecosystem so that we can get it to look like it used to, like it used to flow as a river of grass. Recognizing that we're not going to take agriculture out of business. There's always going to be some form of agriculture. We're all going to be continuing to live here, assuming we see some amount of restoration in our lifetime. So it's taking what we have and working with it to the best of our ability. And we actually know quite a lot about this ecosystem. So what SERP is largely about is increasing the water pie. So if we could just look into the SERP plan and pull out all of the storage features in this, it would look something like this particular pie I'm showing you here. The largest piece of that pie is called ASR. This is called Aquifer Storage and Recovery. Aquifer storage and recovery is a really interesting concept. It's actually a practice that works quite well in some areas. I spent a number of years working in Texas. They use aquifer storage and recovery successfully in the Edwards Aquifer region in the hill country of Texas. And the idea is that you send water below ground and you create a bubble of water. When you have this massive event that delivers water, the way to get rid of it, send it down to the ground, create this bubble, you pull that water out when you need it at some point later. There was just this week, a report published by the Army Corps of Engineers and National Research Council reviewed, National Academies was involved with, looking at the viability of aquifer storage and recovery, which in the CERT plan made up about 70% of the storage solution. They found that about a third of this capacity is viable. The rest of it, probably not. So we can take this 70% piece of the pie and shrink it down to about a third of what it is, and we need to rethink the rest, right? We need to come up with other storage solutions. Well, we're moving 5% of the storage in the CERT plan forward. The C43, C44 projects, Lower Eden River Lagoon, these are important projects for those basins and will certainly bring benefits. So it's heartening to see these projects go forward. But really, these projects are designed to deal with local basin issues and dealing with the inflow needs of these estuaries during dry years and dry seasons in order to maintain optimal estuarine conditions for species like spotted sea trout. But this figure on the right shows that until we start building in things like the EAA reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee, we're not going to see any significant benefits in terms of those high season, high pulse flows that we saw in the summer of 2013. So really, it's taking this other surface storage piece of the pie and considering that to be the future of Everglades restoration. This is storage that is tried and true. It's actually rather cost effective. If we take numbers from South Florida Water Management Districts and their planning for the A1 reservoir, ASR for the Kissimmee River, and then we've done some cost estimates for in-ground storage that was conceived for the lake belt. We find that the above-ground storage solution is actually the most cost-effective form of storage for the Everglades. Unfortunately, we missed this opportunity that we had for land purchase in the agricultural area this year. And it's really disheartening when we think about the opportunity for a willing land seller in the future. So we're going to keep our eyes on this. We're going to stay focused. We're going to look for opportunities in the future because this is really what we need in order to have benefits for the entire ecosystem from the northern estuaries all the way down to Florida Bay. We can't wait long because, again, I said we're 15 years in Everglades restoration. Sea level's rising. We need to do something to understand the effects of this. Habitats are already transitioning. We've got a lot of signs to show that areas at the southern edge of the Everglades have migrated landward over the last 50 years. We've seen changes take place over the last 15 years in terms of significant mangrove transition landward. And in the Everglades, because of the landscape down here, change is really just a matter of inches. Sea level rise now, we'll say, is on the order of about 1 inch every 10 years. 60% of Everglades National Park is less than 36 inches above sea level. We all know it's a flat landscape, very gentle slope. It's about 1 to 2 inches for every mile you go landward from the edge of Florida Bay. Now, thinking about as sea level rises, the elevation of the soil in the Everglades is extremely important. Think about the issues of land loss in coastal Louisiana. The soil building rate in the Everglades is about 3 inches every century. That is not going to keep pace with sea level rise. We've seen some pretty phenomenal numbers in mangroves. It appears that under current rates of sea level rise, mangroves in some areas have kept pace with that rate. In other areas, they haven't. Soil loss in overdrained areas, and the picture I showed you of Pahioki earlier, we are going to lose soil elevation there this year, no doubt. And in some areas, we can lose up to 1 inch or more per year, especially if we experience a muck burn where those soils actually catch fire. Now, there's also another phenomenon that we've been tracking, and it's due to the work of Dr. Hal Wanless and some others that have been working out on Cape Sable for a number of years that have documented this concept of peak collapse, where we see dramatic loss of soil elevation in a matter of a decade or so. This is unknown, but if we go to Cape Sable, it's an interesting story there. This dashed line that I've highlighted, this is at the southwestern corner of the Florida Peninsula. So it's at the upper edge of Florida Bay. The Florida Keys are just to the south of this. East Cape is the southernmost point in the continental U.S. Flamingo is over there to the east as a reference point. In the 1920s, there were a number of attempts to drain the interior of Cape Sable, which was predominantly freshwater marsh. Those canals, many of them exist today and have continued eroding through time because the tidal energy in this area is quite strong. And just within a couple of decades, there was a pretty dramatic area of marsh collapse that occurred. And Wanless has documented this quite well in a number of reports. And this is a photo just showing, a couple of photos showing the extent of soil elevation loss, about knee-high in some areas. So talking about a foot or more of soil elevation loss, just due to exposure from saltwater. And there's a large area of open water as a result of that. Now, we're currently doing a number of experiments in Everglades National Park. I'm working with colleagues from National Park Service, the South Florida Water Management District. Florida International University is actually leading this effort to understand how saltwater exposure in these freshwater marshes leads to peak collapse, marsh collapse. And so we've got a number of experiments set up where we're actually dosing these areas with saltwater, tracking changes over time. But at this particular site, you can see it's been recently burned. So the combination of that and recent saltwater exposure, we're already seeing peak collapse at this particular location in Lower Shark River Slough. It's a work in progress. It's something that we're going to continue to track. It was identified as a priority by the National Academy of Sciences in the last biennial review of Everglades restoration. So we're going to stay on top of this, and it's with funding from agencies like Florida Sea Grant, support from the Water Management District, National Science Foundation, that we're going to make this happen. But as we restore flow to the south, we need to be able to address concerns. And one of the biggest concerns is that if we increase flow, we're going to see a degradation of water quality in the Everglades and all the way down into Florida Bay. This is a complicated issue. But if we look at the entire system, we know that the remedies that we've had to pay for, all of us as taxpayers of Florida have had to pay for, we're seeing a system-wide improvement in phosphorus concentrations across the Everglades. You may not know this, but we've paid for about 60,000 acres of treatment marshes to clean up phosphorus pollution coming off the agricultural area at a cost of close to $2 billion. That is to deal with the existing flow of polluted water coming into the Everglades. It doesn't even scratch the surface in what we need in terms of restoration flows. And believe it or not, that close to $2 billion hasn't been enough. We need to spend another $900 million for the Restoration Strategies project, which are really the fixes to the existing STA infrastructure to meet the 10 part per billion threshold that's protective of the Everglades. But we're seeing benefits system-wide in phosphorus concentrations. Now, at the southern end of the system, in terms of Florida Bay, there have been some concerns that restoring flow to that part of the system will also lead to nitrogen or phosphorus pollution. And we know that not to be the case. In fact, the impacts of overdrained soils and the loss of soil and the mobilization of nutrients associated with that material and export into Florida Bay is a bigger problem. And we know that restoring flow has a much more of an improved effect on water quality, that is not going to be the case. What we really need to be paying attention to is the stability of our coastal peat soils. This is what it looks like. If you dig down into some of those freshwater marshes, it's organic soil. It's roots, it's stems, it's leaves of partially degraded plants. This stuff accumulates over time in wetlands. If you drain the wetland, this disappears, you lose elevation, and it floods more quickly. It's just a simple matter of that. This is a photo I took of one of our sawgrass plants showing the extent of heat collapse that's occurred around it at a site that we know has been exposed to salt water. This is a nice picture because you can see that about 8 to 10 inches of the root zone is exposed. This has occurred within the lifetime of the sawgrass plant, which is maybe 10 years old. They don't live much older than that. So this is a pretty dramatic loss of soil elevation. You can also see that the soil is almost like a muddy soup. It's no longer that fibrous, organic peat soil. It turns to soup. Now, when that area floods, that soup gets transmitted downstream and into offshore areas, contributing to algae blooms. So this is something that we really need to pay attention to. We need to protect peat soils. And we do that by restoring flow. We also know that restoring flow south increases the viability of habitats, not just mangroves and freshwater marshes, but also our estuarine seagrass habitats offshore and fisheries associated with those based on the work that Chris Kelbel has done. And we also know that increasing the flow also improves the connectivity across habitats. We think that fish that live in bays just stay in the bays. A lot of them actually migrate up into freshwater areas to feed on small crayfish that are available at different times of the year. And we know that increasing the flow also improves the connectivity across those different types of habitats. So lastly, I just want to acknowledge the different groups that I'm working with, as well as the funding agencies. And I guess we'll take questions at the panel.
Okay. It is my great honor to introduce Richard Grosso. Richard Grosso is a professor of law at the Shepherd Broad Law Center at Noble Beach Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where he teaches land use and environmental law, Florida constitutional law. I'm everybody right now on Florida constitutional law, and directs the environmental land use law practice clinic. Professor Grosso is a widely recognized legal expert, practicing lawyer and policy advocate with 28 years of experience litigating and advocating on statewide and South Florida environmental issues. His teaching and legal practice specializes in land use, growth management, and environmental policy and permitting issues. He's the former director and general counsel of the Everglades Law Center, a public interest law firm which represents citizens and environmental interests in land use matters concerning the Florida Everglades, Florida Keys, and the South Florida ecosystem. He is also a former legal director for 1,000 Friends of Florida and a former attorney for the Florida Departments of Community Affairs. Anyone know what that is? No longer here, okay. Abolished by our current governor. And the Florida Department of Environmental Regulation, which is now in the process of changing its name to something that does not involve regulation or protection. Grosso has successfully litigated a number of significant and precedent-setting cases. Now, you can find information about these cases and more information about the speakers in the lengthy handout that we gave you. But there are 3 cases I want you to know about that I think are really important. First is 1,000 Friends of Florida versus Palm Beach County, which strictly enforced the Palm Beach County land use plan and protected the Everglades agricultural area from widespread lime rock mining, thus preserving its environmental restoration potential. A second case that Richard litigated was Florida Wildlife Federation and Sierra Club versus U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which halted construction of the Scripps Research Institute on the fringe of the Everglades in western Palm Beach County and resulted in the relocation of the project to an urban infill area. And the third is Sierra Club et al. Versus Miami-Dade County, which overturned the state approval for a commercial airport at the former Homestead Air Force Base. If I have to pick an environmental attorney in the state, both of them are here today. Richard Grosso and David Diaz. My great honor.
Thank you. I think that the Sugar Hill Sector Plan, juxtaposed against where we are in the history of restoration and this opportunity and imperative to get land for water storage, is one of the most crucial moments that I've seen in my career, which started in 1986 here in Florida. It encapsulates everything that we have tried to do as a state, and it pits the modern legal tools and modern science and modern economics versus the old political and economic structure and way of doing things. We have a multi-billion-dollar restoration plan, the need for it, because of the way we did development in Florida for so many decades. We have a land use planning law which still exists and is still pretty strong, even though it was weakened pretty well in 2011. We have that law because of the way we made land use planning, development, and transportation decisions. We meant to change that in a major way. And so when you look at the issues we're facing now, we have the final missing piece, big picture missing piece of Everglades restoration, the water storage imperative south of Lake Okeechobee. And as we're debating how, when we're going to do that, along comes this major development proposal right in that same general area. Advocated for, touted in a way reminiscent of all that stuff that happened all those decades ago. More development, more people will come, it'll be great for the economy. So we stand at this place where the state administration, current administration running the state, may well be faced with a choice. Do we do the things we know we need to do? Clearly, unambiguously, or which we know is what most of the 8 million people in South Florida require for their future, or do we make the exact same kind of decision that we made that got us here in the first place yet again? That's where we stand. And the state may have an important decision to make at the beginning of next year. The idea is the sector plan proposal. A sector plan is a fancy name for your general land use comprehensive plan amendment. The idea of comprehensive planning as it instituted in 1985, as it remains in Florida law today, is this idea of you make decisions based on actual data, actual science, actual engineering facts. You take a look at the future and the existing scenario of an area. What's its environmental sensitivity? What's its drainage patterns? Where's water going to come from? Where are the roads? How much land do we need to meet our realistic economic and population growth needs? And you compare all that and you make, under the terms of the law, the best, most appropriate land use decision for that particular piece of land. We authorized these specific animals called sector plans a few years ago. The benefit of which, the purpose of which, was to apply to large rural areas. And we have one here, obviously. And the idea of a sector plan was to take advantage of this large piece of ownership and take that advantage by securing for the public, in exchange for pretty significantly increased development rights, approvals. They're actually not rights, potential rights. In exchange for that, secure large swaths, big, large, permanent areas for protection and restoration of natural resources. That was the concept, that in exchange for what are clearly legally gratuitous increases in development potential for landowners, the other side of that coin is because of the impact on the other side of that, they would grant permanent, large, adequate, meaningful areas for permanent protection. And the one thing that's the most significant change for sector plans compared to other general land use plans is that we wouldn't hold them to a demonstrated need over the next 5 or 10 years, even though we do not need more commercial or more residential or whatever development in that location. Because of what we're trying to achieve, these big picture ecological protection and restoration things, we won't hold you to a demonstration of need. But other than that, all the other basic planning requirements apply. There's got to be science, there's got to be engineering. You have to write plans that make sense, that are coherent, that are clear, that are specific, that are meaningful. The challenge of these things, and this is still kind of at the beginning. We have a few sector plans approved in the state. The challenge, we don't have a great long-term track record. The challenge of these things is that, are we going to approve sector plans in a manner that clearly grants potential development rights to landowners, but those protections on the other side, those long-term permanent protections for regional ecosystems, are vague, are iffy, are inadequate, are not what the science tells us we need, but are instead what the landowner was willing to give us that was left over after they got done planning their development. That is the challenge of sector plans. So into that backdrop comes the proposed Sugar Hill Sector Plan. The United States Sugar Corporation, the Hilliard Brothers, proposed a plan amendment to Hendry County. I'm sorry? I'm sorry if you can't read it.
Yeah, because I can't read it. You're going to take a little bit of time, I think, to be just there because the print is really tiny.
All right, very good, very good. Then, all right. What else you guys need? All right. Water? Does jacket match the shirt? All right. The proposal to combine landowners, up to 18,000 homes, up to 25 million square feet of commercial development. The piece of earth is 67 square miles. That is an enormous piece of land. That is an amazingly great amount of residential, commercial, and related development. It would be spread out over a number of different land use categories: employment center, long-term agriculture, mixed-use urban, mixed-use suburban, rural estates, and natural resource management. I put with a question mark. Where is it? These are the land use categories that I just rattled off, the colored areas. As you can see, it's not a contiguous parcel of land, it's spread out. The planning documents in the proposal do not explain why the land is spread out. It does not explain the relationship from one parcel of land to another. It is not clear at all what planning objectives are to be achieved by having this great amount of development potential approved for these disparate parcels of land. The other thing this particular map shows in the crosshatched areas are the potential option lands under the contract to buy land from the United States Sugar Corporation. And you can see, of course, the location just to the south and west of Lake Okeechobee. This next map I'm showing you the slightly bigger picture, locational map showing you where these lands are related to the lake. The geographic setting here is, and I remind you, the amount of development here is not for a new city. It would be large enough for several new cities. Let's put aside for a moment the ecosystem restoration challenges that Dr. Davis was talking to us about. The land use planning law is about restoration. It's about restoring land, promoting that. But take that aside, and let's assume that Everglades restoration is not an issue here. It's not on the table. It has nothing to do with these lands. Let's just assume that for a minute. The setting here is a major agricultural area, very low-lying, very flood-prone, with a complete lack of urban or suburban drainage infrastructure, with a major public safety issue with the dike around the lake in terms of putting a significant number of people and billions of dollars worth of commerce and structures in its way, a roadway system that is for agriculture, not for suburban development. And where the state of the art is, as I mentioned before, that land use planning and land development economics, ecosystem restoration science have been telling us now for at least 30 years that the old way of doing business doesn't work economically or scientifically. That is the big picture setting for this proposal to walk into. Now, of course, one of the particularly important things to those of us in this room is the water management and restoration planning that is otherwise trying to go on here, and I'm only going to mention a few things. The initial restoration science, the National Academy peer reviews, the Water Management District documents and its option contracts, and the River of Grass planning efforts that it went through as a result of that. The very recent Florida Senate commissioned study by the University of Florida. The Water Management District's web pages, U.S. Sugar web pages, clearly tell us what Dr. Davis was telling us, that we cannot restore the Everglades without major water storage pretty soon in this general region of South Florida. And that was the whole purpose of this land acquisition project that the Water Management District Governing Board has just, in terms of the 2015 option, turned its back on, but a 2020 option remains. And of course, many folks within the district, many others have said, we didn't think that was a great deal, we'll consider another deal later. So let's assume there remains no option contract at all. The science is clear, the knowledge is clear. There needs to be massive water storage in this general area soon, somehow. So that is among the most salient natural characteristics and facts that apply to this proposed development project of very direct relevance under the state law that governs the approval of sector plans. So under the sector planning process, the county gave preliminary approval last summer 2014. Just before the election in the fall of 2014, the state, the Department of Economic Opportunity, that makes the ultimate state decision, and the underlying comments given to DEO by the Department of Environmental Protection, by the Water Management District and others, were by far the strongest objections to any land use plan amendment I have seen since the 2011 statutory revisions in many, many years. Extraordinarily strong. Because of all the things that we're talking about, because of all the things that I've mentioned. Where will the water, you are looking, the other thing I haven't mentioned is we are in a critically water-starved area during the dry season. If we were not even trying to restore the Everglades here, if that was off the table, where will the water come for that amount of development in this area? The infrastructure, all of those issues, they were very strong. That aspect about the sector plans where their basic intent, if you're going to grant all this development approval, is to secure permanent restoration and protection for huge chunks of natural resource lands, That issue was not even analyzed by Henry County and the applicant, U.S. Sugar and Hilliard. They acted as though the potential acquisition of these lands and the need for water storage in this general area never existed. Now there's some policy leeway that local governments have to adopt things like sector plans, but you have to be based on what they say the best available science, the best available data. To completely ignore the mega issue there, in addition to the lack of drainage and the public safety and water scarcity, was just not professionally acceptable. It was off the charts, and the state agency comments adequately and very accurately reflected those objections and those basic fundamental problems with the sector plan. The state recently gave the county an extension of time until the very end of this year in order to move forward or not with that sector plan. And as I speak in front of you, I do not know if the landowners are seriously attempting to pursue that project, or whether the county will agree that it's good for the county to do so. That will remain to be seen. And if they do ultimately adopt this plan by the end of this year, that will be a major test for the state's administration. We tend to see in the history of these things often strong state objections. We haven't seen that in 3 years, 4 years now, but even in the past history of land use planning, you often will see strong state objections and then some minor tweaks and changes to the plan, and then the state say, oh, that did it. And that will be what we look for. That's the big challenge here. In my opinion, the planning deficiencies, the planning challenges, the basic facts about the location, the geography of this parcel of land are overwhelming problems for this land use amendment. I cannot see how, no matter how it might be dressed up, this sector plan could ever be seen as complying with the state's land use planning process, the sector planning requirements. That is my very strong opinion for a lot of the reasons that you see listed here, including the really vague planning, the planning standards, the development standards that were written into the sector plan. When you looked at it, for how is this going to happen? How will things that need to be protected? How will specific decisions be made about development on such a massive area? It was bewildering to read how vague the language was. And that leads me to the economic argument, because the argument made in support of this is the same economic argument that we have been reading for a century in this state. Open up more land for development, people will come, they will create economic activity and jobs. And we've learned a lot about how real development economics works. And that notion, just open it up for development and we'll all be better off, has been discredited for a very long time now. Economic development in modern economic development science is about targeting specific industries, targeting specific pieces of land that make sense for that industry because of the characteristics of it. And we go after that, we create what we need, and that's how you do it. Just opening up 40-some thousand acres of development with vague development standards, with no specific projects in mind, except perhaps some idea of complementary development related to the airport there, which doesn't need anything in the same amount of zeros anywhere close to 46,000 acres of land. There's no economic development projects. There's nothing on the table specifically. Under our land use planning law, where there's a specific economic development project that makes sense, you can adopt a specific land use amendment for that project, site-specific, and you do it right, and it doesn't take that long. The idea of a sector plan is it grants 50-year-long potential development rights. 50-year-long, meaning any development that's approved there could get pulled a permit for tomorrow, or it might not happen over the next 50 years. It's extremely vague. It is extremely speculative that it will create any meaningful amount of economic development. Not long ago, the county approved, Henry County approved, and the state approved, and it is now in place. They are now in place. 2 prior sector plans covering 46,000 acres, allowing over 44,000 homes to be built, allowing over 9 million square feet of commercial development to be built. That's already approved and unbuilt, waiting for economic development to happen in Hendry County. The numbers simply cannot add up under anybody's wildest economic development dreams. With all of that amount of approved land use plans sitting there waiting to happen, that we somehow need 1 more acre in the Sugar Hill Sector Plan for economic development. The numbers simply cannot add up. That economic development argument simply cannot hold water. And I say that as somebody who would very much like to see this region of Florida diversify its economy, become a more balanced area economically. But the numbers are way beyond. The idea that we would preclude meaningful restoration options to such an extent to meet a need that can already be met in so many other places is exactly the opposite of what land use planning is supposed to be. Land use planning is supposed to be, you make smart decisions about where it makes sense to have an amount of economic development, that you actually have some numbers to justify you realistically expect. And that's what you approve. Not just this, let's approve these things, let's say we're going to help the economy, but the landowner has flexibility to do some of those things or not over the next 50 years. And so you worry about these crude, rhetorical arguments about economic development that are the same things that got us in this mess in the first place. And you really wonder if the state is really up to the task of making decisions based on 21st century science and law, or are they going to repeat the mistakes of the past? Now, I'm an optimist. I think that the state's objections to this proposed plan amendment when they were first sent up to the state at the end of last year were very heartening. The state did its job. And I think we should have every expectation that if for some reason this sector plan continues to be moved forward by the county, that the state will continue to do its job and demonstrate its commitment to restoring the Everglades, making smart water management decisions in this crucial region first, and making economic development that makes sense a part of that in appropriate locations in appropriate amounts. That would be my hope. Given all the circumstances, the sector plan that is on the table, I think, is a non-starter, is completely inappropriate. It's not even in that gray area that the land use laws can allow for land use decisions. And I would expect the state to deny it, and I would hope that Hendry County and the landowners would join us in making smart 21st century decisions for that county and for this region. Thank you.
Take 10 minutes for questions and answers, and then we will move on to Chairman Billy, who will be the next speaker, be our keynote speaker. Please again, we'll state the process. If you want to speak, stand behind the microphone. The line's already before me. After you speak, please fill out the release form so that we can include your question and the response in the videos that we'll produce. All right.
Yes, hi. My name is Jeannie Economos, and I work for the Farm Worker Association of Florida in Apopka. And I've worked since 1996 on the issue of farm workers and Lake Apopka and the pollution and environmental justice issues on Lake Apopka. One of my concerns is that a lot of the discussion around Everglades restoration and the contamination of the water flowing into the, or through and out of the Everglades, the agricultural area, is focused solely on phosphorus. And we know from Lake Apopka that there's lots of issues of pesticides, and I don't hear anybody really addressing the issues of pesticides. On Lake Apopka, there are persistent organic pollutants, organochlorine pesticides that were used on those farms for decades. And a lot of those same pesticides are used in the agricultural area south of Lake Apopka. South of Lake Okeechobee, including endosulfan, which have had impacts on wildlife. And I'm really concerned that I have not seen a lot of the science really focused on the impacts of restoring water flows through the agricultural area and what the impacts of those pesticides will have both on wildlife and on human health.
All right, great question.
Well, I don't intend to discount the importance of other contaminants in the system. We tend to focus on phosphorus as it's the limiting nutrient throughout much of the ecosystem. As you get into the estuarine areas, nitrogen becomes important. Certainly there are a number of organic contaminants, pesticides, herbicides that we really need to do a better job of looking at. We don't fully understand the problem. I had a question at a presentation I gave earlier this week where somebody was concerned about endocrine disruptors, and absolutely we need to be looking at this, and a lot of it comes down to research funding. I know of a couple of scientists that are working in this area. There's an organic chemist at Florida International University that is looking at some of these compounds in the environment, but typically it's just a handful of samples. It's not, we don't have any comprehensive studies funded to look at these types of problems.
Let me just say that, on Lake Apopka, they had one of the worst bird deaths in the history of the United States in 1998 and 99 because of the chemicals from the agricultural area, and also the alligator reproductive problems and abnormalities on Lake Apopka. So I really think that needs to be a major focus, and I really want to emphasize that. We've also seen the health impacts on the farm workers on Lake Apopka.
Thank you, Derek. Very well.
My name is Richard Spizak, Progressive News Network. I have a quick question for both of you, if you would entertain it. I understand that we're hearing a lot of best case, if things go well, if they let the state know the state continues to do regulation once again from time to time. I understand that, and that's wonderful that we can talk about the positive potential. My concern is this: given deregulation is the watchword of so much of what passes for government these days, I'm wondering, are we exploring the more probable, serious, negative consequences from where our current policy is driving us? It's nice to say, gee, it'd be great if we could restore water. Gentlemen, the chances of that are good. And whether we look at the saltwater intrusion or we look at the organic phosphates and pesticides, I'm prepared to look happily and positively at many things. But I think, especially gentlemen who study these issues, I'd like to hope that they'll talk to us sensibly about development there. I don't think there's any reason to hope that. And I'd like to think that responsible voices can say, look, this is really where we're going. And I don't hear that, and I don't hear an urgency with that. I'd like to, again, like to hope positive, but I think realistically...
I think people like us think about that every night. We think about it every day and every night. It is the fear that motivates most of us to do what we do. I have found over my long career doing these things that I can either allow myself to be paralyzed by the worst case scenarios, or I can keep swinging as long as we still have a chance. You take your analysis of your worst case scenarios and you factor that into your tactics, your strategies, the things you're trying to achieve. I disagree that there has been a complete lack of urgency on the behalf of the environmental community. Certainly not on my part.
My name is Maria. I'm from Central Florida, but I'm not representing a group today with my question or comment here. In regards to talking about global warming and sea level rise, about 91% of Amazon destruction is due to animal agriculture. About 29% of the world's fresh water is used for animal production. Animal agriculture is the source of 51% of all greenhouse gases. And Sierra Club Miami is taking on a new initiative to introduce Meatless Mondays, and I completely applaud that effort. And I would hope that anyone that considers themselves an environmentalist would also, at minimum, try to do Meatless Mondays. I realize that the meat and dairy and big pharma lobby is huge. It's money, it's jobs, it's lobbyists. They run the country, so I realize I'm not making a lot of friends in the room right now by talking about a very inconvenient truth. I used to eat meat 2-3+ times a day. It hurt when I gave up eating meat. I'm not suggesting everybody go vegetarian or vegan. I realize that's a huge thing for a lot of people to tackle, to try to do. But with the amount of people being born every day, with the amount of resources being used, we are on a completely unsustainable track if we continue to follow through with the traditional American diet. So I'm not trying to offend anybody. I realize it's a cultural issue, it's a society, it's rooted in emotion and culture. But I would just like to see more environmental groups, especially in the state of Florida, considering we go back and forth with Texas being the top producer for cattle and beef and dairy in this country. I would like to see a lot of environmental groups and people that consider themselves environmentalists to really consider, at minimum, Meatless Mondays with their organization, cutting back a few times a day with their meat consumption. And there's a lot of information out there, but this kind of goes along with the tragedy of the commons. For all of us to acknowledge all these issues, and I'm sure a lot of us drive Priuses and small cars, and we recycle and we go to Tallahassee and this and that. I would really just like to see a push for talking about big ag being an issue, freshwater use. And if you could answer this question, has the state of Florida now denied any new consumptive use permits? That means no new bottling plants and no new ranchers, because I believe there was a ranch thing happening up in Volusia County, and the consumptive use permit was denied due to the fact that they were trying to utilize too much of our fresh water, and now that we've got all this saltwater intrusion, we're running out.
I'll be brief, because I know we have others who want to ask questions. I don't know the answer to that question. CUPs are not regularly denied, they're rarely denied. Sometimes they're denied, they're granted for less than the application was, but it remains a major problem, the granting of CUPs, no question about it.
Okay, so I have 5 minutes left for questions.
Drew Martin, Conservation Chair for Waxahachie Group of the Sierra Club and former Chair of the Everglades Committee for the Sierra Club. And I thank you both for your wonderful presentations. I want to direct this question towards Richard. And what is the failure of the state when it comes to things like mitigation and 404 permits? We saw in Steve's presentation how so much development, and we see this in Broward County, moving into wetlands. Why is it that we can never see the word no, and we never see the state turning down the destruction of wetlands, and that mitigation is such a failure? We see the creation of mitigation and it's destroyed.
This is an opinion, obviously, but there can be a culture of those who work processing permits and those who work getting them become quite friendly, and it becomes very hard to say no to your friends. There's a certain economic or political, momentum that makes it hard for regulatory people to say no. There tends to be a thumb on the scale when looking at the value of mitigation and ignoring some things when looking at the value of that wetland to be impacted. So it's a chronic historic problem in the state of Florida. It's part of the overall ethic that does need to be changing very quickly.
I'll just add that really the system's not set up to say no.
But the law very much does allow it, you know?
Next question.
Bill Lana, Florida Atlantic University Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, a research professor in the Environmental Sciences program. One quick comment for...
Just a question, please. We have 3 people, each get a minute now. And we're going to get everybody.
Okay, then to Dr. Davis, besides phosphorus, sulfur, okay, needs to be looked at. Phosphorus from headwaters going to the Everglades. I study phosphorus pollution from the Wellington equestrian problem. And also on ASRs, has anyone looked at the injection of surface waters with oxygen and organic matter into carbonate aquifers, where you're now generating CO2, you go through carbonic acid, you erode the carbonate, you generate floods and potential sinkholes. So there's a lot going on there. Mercury linked with sulfur. needs to be looked at. You mentioned sea trout in northern Florida. Darrell Rembo over at Florida Gulf has looked at increasing sulfur there. So there's a lot more problems rather than just restoring water flow, or the church of flow, as rock salt used to call it.
Okay, Stephen,
a lot of those problems there.
I'll just quickly say that I encourage you to take a look at the ASR evaluation report that was released this past week. They deal with a lot of those water quality issues. The sulfate, mercury issue, we certainly need to be looking at that. It seems that mercury is coming under control, maybe not globally, but certainly domestically. But we still need to understand that areas of the Everglades are showing a legacy effect with agricultural addition of sulfate.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Sue Caruso from the Broward Sierra Group. You probably already answered my question, but I don't see that I know of any of our politicians or the decision makers here today. And I'm curious, do you think we need to educate them more? You know, when we see this information, you kind of want to cry. You know, how can they deny it? Do they not know it? Or, as you said before, the way the system's set up, they just ignore it?
I think our biggest problem is not lack of science or education. I think our biggest problem is campaign finance, if you're going to be honest with that. You know, if it's worth a few $100 a year to me, then I gotta make campaign contributions. That's on an individual basis.
We have a panel in which we have experts who are going to address that very question this afternoon. All right, I want to ask how many elected officials are here present in the audience? If you could raise your hand. If you're an elected official. Martin County is here. Official want to identify themselves? Over there. All right. No? Okay. Over there.
I'm Palm Beach County Stormwater Conservation District. I'm paid, by the way.
Sir, you are? Right.
Carson Turner, Hendry County.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Okay, last question.
Larry Grossman, and my question is to Mr. Barroso. There still is an auction for 2020 for purchase of U.S. sugar land, and I understand it covers 153,000 acres. How does that relate to the development, the sector planning proposal? Or is the graphic that you showed coextensive with that?
I don't have that in front of me, but one of the key issues with the option land is that it's a you must buy it all or buy none of it thing. And so any impact either to actual development or increased land values to any of that land makes the exercise of that option potentially more difficult. And so there is that direct relationship. So, you know, hopefully what can happen is that some great win-win situation can be achieved where there is maybe a new deal for land surgically that we need the right amount of it for land acquisition, which in my view would leave plenty of land available for good economic development projects within Hendry County. It's time to make these decisions with a surgeon's scalpel now and not, you know, a sledgehammer anymore. And I think that parsing the language of the contract and looking at all these things surgically is what we need to do. We need to get past rhetoric, I think, on either side.
Thank you.
Okay. Then in that case, we want to thank our panel on Everglades. Commissioner Held, just identify yourself. I know you stood. If you tell people who you are.
I'm Sarah Hurd from Martin County.
Okay. You could all leave and then we want to bring Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, would you join us at the dais? my great pleasure to introduce Collie Billy, who is currently serving in his second term as chairman of the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. Chairman Billy was first inaugurated as chairman on January 5th, 2010, and then inaugurated for his second term on December 4th, 2013. As chairman, Collie Billy works with the Miccosukee Business Council to fulfill their roles as stewards of the Miccosukee people. The tribe is a sovereign domestic nation in the United States, comprised of approximately 650 members, and is located in the heart of the Everglades. The Everglades have been the homeland of the Miccosukee people for hundreds of years, which is where the Miccosukee people still live today. The tribe continues to practice its culture and traditions in the Everglades. At his first inauguration, Chairman Billy made several commitments to his people. He is committed to good governance, protecting and enhancing the tribe's sovereignty, economic development, and environmental stewardship. Chairman Billy works to fulfill these goals for his people every day. Chairman Billy has profound respect for the tribe's beautiful and unique homelands, exemplified in a simple philosophy. Quote, "We must honor the earth from where we are made." His dedication to protecting the tribe's lands and traditional ways of life and culture is intertwined with the tribe's unwavering commitment to protect and preserve the Everglades. Chairman Billy studied management at Stetson University, where he graduated with a BBA degree. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to your seat.
Thank you for the introduction. And, thank you for allowing me to be here. I want to make an informal introduction before I get started with my prepared presentation. I want to say that I'm Collie Billy. I am the chairman for the Miccosukee Business Council for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. Today is Saturday. Normally, us elected officials like to stay home on weekends, but I decided that this was an important issue. So I came up here, but at the same time, I brought my wife and my daughters. I just want to say I was born and raised in the Everglades. My parents had 7 of us. Ever since I was little, I remember the Everglades the way it used to be, and it is not the same anymore. We have lost a lot of the animals that we used to see, or at least I used to see. And also back then, I used to swim around in my backyard. We had our own pool, which was the Everglades. And believe it or not, we used to drink directly from the Everglades. But today, the water is more of a tea color. Back when I was like 6 years old, I remember the water was crystal clear. The Tamiami Canal that runs along Tamiami Trail. And remember, we used to be able to see down to the bottom because we used to pluck 15-pound bass with a spear because we were able to see down to the bottom. Today, you can't see down to the bottom. It's all black. It's very disheartening. I wish that my daughter could see what I had seen when I was growing up. And I'm starting to think that she'll never see what I saw, and what makes it worse for me is my grandkids will never see what I saw. That's what we're dealing with. So just wanted to bring that up. But anyway, moving on to my prepared presentation. I want to say thank you to the Sierra Club and to all of you attending today for the opportunity to provide the Miccosukee Tribe's view on Everglades restoration.
While all of us here share the goal of restoring the Everglades, as the people who have lived and continue to live in the Everglades, restoration is essential to the health and vitality of our community. Poor water quality has had and continues to have a devastating effect on our land and community. We believe that restoration must be for all of the Everglades and not just for Everglades National Park. The tribe strongly supports a comprehensive approach to restoration that focuses on improving water quality throughout the Everglades before it is too late and before the Everglades are forever damaged. For hundreds of years, the Everglades have been our home. The Everglades was our refuge as we avoided removal to the west, like so many other tribes were forced to do. For generations, the land and the waters of the Everglades have sustained us. It is part of who we are as people. When it is damaged, we suffer as a people. Because of this, we have always sought to honor and protect our environment through responsible stewardship of the land. However, after years of environmental degradation caused by others, our way of life has been irreversibly altered. When Everglades National Park was first created in 1934, our people who lived in that area were rounded up and forced to live along Tamiami Trail. But we retain strong connections to these lands in the park, and we are committed to preserving this land. We have seen the damage that poor water quality can have on our existing land. We do not wish to see what has and is happening to our lands in the Water Conservation Area 3A to happen to our historic lands in Everglades National Park. This is why we continue to strongly advocate for improvement in water quality for the entire Everglades. Many years ago, the Miccosukee community noticed changes in the Everglades. Slowly but steadily, areas that our community relied on were disappearing and being replaced by cattails. Steadily, the cattails grew into large areas that overtook our tribal hunting grounds and cultural areas. In response to these changes seen, the community started the Everglades Study Program in 1982 to observe, monitor, record these changes. Today, more than 30 years later, the program still exists as a community science and outreach program to document the effects of nutrient pollution on tribal lands. Because we are the people most impacted by the health of the Everglades, the tribe has fully supported restoration efforts of the Everglades. In an attempt to limit pollution and impact on tribal land, in 1997, the Miccosukee Business Council adopted water quality standards that included a 10-part pavilion standard for phosphorus, which was identified as the main contributor to pollution in our Everglades. In 1999, the EPA approved the standards, making this the first numeric standard for phosphorus in the Everglades wetlands. The Miccosukee 10-part pavilion standard remains the most stringent standard to protect our homeland. In addition, the tribe has been at the forefront of water quality efforts for the broader Everglades. Being a party to the 1991 settlement agreement that created phosphorus standards for Everglades National Park and Waxahachie National Wildlife Refuge. The tribe was also deeply engaged in the development of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP, and supported its passions by Congress. The tribe initiated the efforts that have resulted in the most recent EPA state, quote, framework agreement, unquote, that will construct a series of water quality projects. We have always advocated for true restoration of the Everglades through a holistic approach focused on improving the quality of the water first so that we do not continue to damage the Everglades. While significant financial resources have been devoted to Everglades restoration, efforts have been piecemeal and have lacked coordination and follow-through to completion, leaving many projects uncompleted even after millions of dollars have been spent on them. Instead, projects that do not address water quality and are not even part of the original Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan have moved forward in a seemingly arbitrary way. We have been hearing for the last couple of years that the key to restoration is, quote, send it south, unquote. The Miccosukee tribe would like to see water flows to the south be restored. But this is not attainable until the existing water quality improves. This is why the Miccosukee tribe have been working relentlessly to improve water quality throughout the Everglades. After many years of scientific study and pollution control programs, water quality is still a major problem on the tribe's land and throughout the Everglades. The L28 canal system, which dead ends on the Miccosukee Reservation, still delivers rich nutrient water at concentrations that can spike to over 10 times the protective limit. The nutrient condition in the L28 canal comes from the upstream agricultural sources and often exceeds 100 parts per billion, creating algae bloom and cattail growth, which impacts over 5,500 acres of tribal wetlands. Open water and sawgrass are being replaced with dense plant overgrowth. Given the enormous cost of Everglades restoration, limited resources must be used wisely and effectively. Miccosukee has and will continue to strongly oppose the bridging of the Tamiami Trail unless and until water quality problems have been resolved. Currently, the water quality of water entering Everglades National Park barely meets or has even violated the water quality standards set under the consent decree. In fact, it is our understanding that there was an exceedance of the long-term limit for phosphorus for water flowing into the Everglades National Park last October. Given these water quality problems, an operational plan to raise the level of the L28 canal in order to flow more water under the bridge and into Everglades National Park will not be permitted due to water quality concerns. Building a new bridge will neither solve these water quality problems nor convey significantly more water to the park. While these water quality problems exist, simply stated, these bridges cannot be used to deliver significantly more water, and the Central Everglades Planning Project cannot be fully implemented without significantly improving water quality first. Rather, while water quality is being addressed to the north, the existing 1-mile bridge and the culverts under the Tamiami Trail, if they are properly maintained, can be used to move as much water as will be allowed to move through the system. Currently, the culverts under the Tamiami Trail and floodgates remain blocked with downstream vegetation preventing more water flows into the park. If these water delivery structures were simply maintained, then they would be more than adequate to flow the amount of water that will be permitted to flow. The Miccosukee tribe has every reason to want historic flows restored, as the limited flows often force water to stack up on the tribe land and Water Conservation Area 3A, flooding our tree islands. This flooding results in the slow but steady destruction of these tree islands, preventing not only our continued use of them, but also the loss of habitat for many animals. But we cannot flow these waters if it is going to further damage the ecosystem. Our land and Water Conservation Area 3A are living proof of the damage that excessive phosphorus can cause. Allowing dirty water to flow throughout the Everglades is not restoration. True restoration begins with fully addressing the water quality problems before allowing that water flow. We recognize that improvements have been made over the years and efforts are currently underway to do more. Unfortunately, improvements in water quality are painfully slow to be realized, often taking years after projects have been completed to see results. More concerning, these current efforts through the EPA state, quote, framework agreement, unquote, still does not address the Western Basin and the L28 Canal System, which dead ends on the Miccosukee Federal Reservation. Nearly 1/3 of all the phosphorus in Water Conservation Area 3A enters the L28 Canal System, and currently there is no specific project designed or being implemented to address the significant inflows of phosphorus. The effects of this have created an area of excessive plant growth that is choking and killing the Everglades ecosystem on our land. As that water flows south through tribal lands and Water Conservation Area 3A, the water is slowly cleaned, but the phosphorus remains. As a result, our land and Water Conservation Area 3A are literally being used as stormwater treatment areas for Everglades National Park. This is why the Miccosukee tribe has said that restoration must address the water quality of all flows of water before entering the water conservation areas, or we will not reach the water quality needed in order to restore water flows to the south. So, I am here today to ask the Sierra Club and all of you to focus your efforts on restoring water quality for all of the Everglades. I ask for your support to stop using Water Conservation Areas 3A as a de facto stormwater treatment area. I ask for your support for projects that will improve the water quality of the L28 Canal System on our lands in the Western Basin. I ask for your support to finish the projects that are needed to clean the water first, so that we may begin to restore the historic flows to the south. Thank you again for this opportunity. It is only by working together that we will be able to truly restore the Everglades. Trinave Shot, that means thank you, and Mikisuki.
Chairman, you have our support. You have our full support. Working for Thank you so much. Thank you. I would like to just, now we're a little bit late, but we can make up the time. So we're going to cut lunch to 30 minutes, 30-minute break. But the good part is that it's a buffet right outside on the other side. So if you just grab your food, bring it back under the tables, and then we'll trim back on the coffee break mid-afternoon as well, and we'll be right back on the schedule. Thank you very much.